You know that somebody wrote the Bible, right? Well, not just somebody, but lots of somebodies, many authors, many source documents, many traditions over about an 850 year to 1,000 year period. And then these were brought together by editors and by redactors, and they were responding to geopolitical events, to changing circumstances, to changing theology, sometimes intentionally driven by an agenda, sometimes just a reaction to things happening. Sometimes, you had to satisfy certain people, so you had to leave in some traditions and take out other traditions, etc. But there are people that are behind the biblical literature. So many different genres, there's poetry, and there's prose and stories and chants and all sorts of things in the biblical literature. But at the bottom of all of that, there are authors and there are editors and there are redactors. And they had a particular aim in mind. They were writing with some agenda. Now, we don't need to be cynical about that. All of us are creating with an agenda in mind. All of us have a point of view. And that is the truth for the biblical authors. They had a particular point of view in mind that was informed by their cultural circumstances, was informed by the culture around them, informed by their cultic practices, etc. Now, here's something that I think we forget in biblical interpretation is we forget about those authors. We forget that there are people somewhat like you and me, not exactly like you and me, because our whole conceptual framework, our worldviews, our points of views, right? They're very different. For me, in 2024 versus somebody who was composing, some sort of poetry in the 10th century before the Common Era, which we think is some of our earliest extant material within the biblical literature, within at least the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. Those people were writing, and they were not completely dissimilar from you and me. So when we're doing biblical interpretive work, we should not forget about there are authors that are at the bottom and behind the text, and they had a particular point of view. And anytime that we say in a contemporary or a modern setting, anytime we say, well, this is what that text really meant, we have to acknowledge we're not doing that with anything approaching certainty. All we're doing in our very best interpretive efforts is to say, well, it is most likely true based on the evidence that this author had such and such an agenda in mind. But anytime that we say in a contemporary context, this is what the text means, we have to know that we're then speaking for an ancient author, and we might be robbing them of their agency. We might be saying, oh, well, I don't know what it meant exactly. Here's what I think it means, right? Anytime we speak authoritatively about the text and try to provide an interpretation that is authoritative, we know that we're robbing the ancient author of some agency, that we're putting our words and our ideologies and our theologies into their mouths. We're imposing later traditions onto the earlier text. Now, this is inevitable. There's no way to avoid doing that because we cannot recover the original authorial or editorial intent because we just don't share the same sort of conceptual frameworks. We're in very different settings in the world. So we can't recover their original intent with anything like certainty. But we can say, hey, it's more likely true that they meant this rather than meaning this other thing. And the way that we do that is through methodology and through principles and by understanding in a particular dating schema, what were some of the cultural ideas that were around? What were some of the geopolitical events? How are these particular words used in this setting and context versus the way that they're used in another setting or context? So we can recover a little bit of the original intent, but we can't do that certainly so. We can't do it absolutely. And so we should remind ourselves that there is no capital T truth when it comes to biblical interpretive work. Nobody has the right answer. Nobody has the absolutely true interpretation. Each interpretive tradition, each interpretive community, even each individual reader like you and me are going to impose and apply some of our implicit biases, some of our unconscious biases, some of our background beliefs that we already have. We're always going to impose those onto the text. It's inevitable. That's just how our brains work. But I think we should be mindful when we are doing that if we say this is for sure what this text meant, that we may be robbing the ancient author of some agency, and we may be imposing our beliefs from a modern context back onto the ancient context. Now, like I say, it's inevitable. We are going to do it no matter what, because we cannot embody the lives of an author in the 10th century BCE or the 7th century BCE or the 2nd century BCE or the 1st century of the Common Era, right? I mean, these are all major stages of biblical development over time in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, and then the apocalyptic and apocryphal literature, and then the New Testament literature, etc. We can't embody their lives, so we're always going to be robbing them of agency. We're always going to be imposing our later beliefs onto them. It's inevitable, but we should be mindful that we're doing it. And anybody who tells you that they have the absolute right interpretation of a text, they are lying to you. Don't believe them. Nobody has the capital T truth. Nobody has, with absolute certainty, the interpretation of a text. It's all up to our interpretive communities, how we are deploying the text to best serve our agendas and our aims in the 21st century. So be mindful, my friends. I hope you do biblical interpretive work. I love it. I do it all the time. I keep a blog on it. I make content about it. So I don't say this to dissuade us or to discourage us, but only to remind us. Anybody who would suggest that they have the absolute and certain and correct interpretation, they don't. They are lying to you, or they are lying to themselves. We cannot fully embody the ancient authors' agendas and their cultural context, etc. So keep that in mind, my friends, anytime you're doing interpretive work, but do it because it's fun to do. All right, much love. I'm out. I got to go eat lunch and get back to work. Peace. Later.